The tables have turned. Trump's aggressive tariffs were supposed to strengthen the United States, but they've backfired, igniting an economic standoff that could cost Americans more than they ever expected. We all know that Canada and the United States were close allies, trading billions and fueling industries on both sides of the border. But Trump's unpredictable policies have shattered that stability, and now Canada is fighting back harder than anyone imagined. Trudeau's bold retaliation has exposed the cracks in Trump's strategy, rallying allies and pushing the United States into a corner. So, what happens when a trade war spirals out of control? Who actually wins? And who will pay the price? Stay with us, because this is a turning point you can't afford to ignore. The bombshell speech. No one believed Justin Trudeau would take such a wartime stance until he did. It was a moment that left Canada stunned, a speech unlike any the country had heard from its prime minister in decades. Standing firm, his voice unwavering, Trudeau did not just address his own citizens. He spoke directly to the American people. We are not booing you. We are not booing your teams. We are not booing your players. We are booing a policy designed to hurt us. And we are insulted. And we are angry. But we are Canadian, which means we are going to stand up for each other. We are going to fight. The words carried the weight of a leader forced into battle, not by choice, but by necessity. Never before had Trudeau spoken with such a sharp, deliberate tone. The nation watched, first in shock, then in unity. The Prime Minister was not merely condemning the tariffs imposed by the United States government. He was rallying his people, preparing them for a long and difficult confrontation. The speech spread like wildfire, with television networks, newspapers, and social media platforms amplifying its impact. Across the country, citizens who had largely been disengaged from economic policy suddenly felt personally involved. It was not just a trade dispute anymore. It was a moment of national defiance. But this speech was not just dramatic. It was the opening salvo in a larger standoff. Why U.S.-Canada trade matters in numbers. If you think this dispute is just politics, wait until you see the trillions tied up in cross-border trade. The United States and Canada share one of the most integrated economic relationships in the world. Every year, more than $1.5 trillion flow between the two nations, making Canada the largest trading partner of the United States. The supply chains of key industries, from automobiles to agriculture, are deeply intertwined, with raw materials and finished products moving seamlessly across the border daily. To put it in perspective, nearly 75% of Canada's exports go directly to the United States. That means when Washington imposes tariffs on key Canadian goods, the impact is immediate and far-reaching. It is not just manufacturers that feel the strain. It is farmers, truckers, construction workers, and millions of everyday consumers. The automotive sector alone tells a powerful story. A single car assembled in the United States or Canada may cross the border multiple times before it reaches the dealership. Steel and aluminum tariffs do not just raise costs, they threaten an entire system built on decades of cooperation and efficiency. The food industry follows the same pattern. Canadian beef, wheat, and dairy products fill American supermarkets, just as American-grown fruits and vegetables stock Canadian grocery aisles. And then there is the matter of energy. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil and natural gas to the United States, keeping refineries running and homes heated. Tariffs or retaliatory measures could disrupt not just business, but daily life. Once you see these numbers, you understand why even a small tariff can unleash a massive ripple effect. Inside Canada, immediate business reactions. Overnight, some Canadian businesses had to rethink their entire supply chain. Here's how they scrambled. For companies that rely on American imports and exports, the impact was instant. At a steel fabrication plant in Ontario, workers watched as costs soared within hours of the tariff announcement. Orders that had been placed weeks earlier suddenly became unaffordable, and long-standing contracts with American clients were thrown into uncertainty. Trucking companies faced similar turmoil. With the price of goods shifting unpredictably, routes that had been routine for decades were now a logistical nightmare. One transportation company owner described it bluntly. Everything changed overnight. Suddenly, we had to figure out whether our loads would even be profitable anymore. We cannot afford to operate in limbo. The effects extended beyond major industries. Small businesses, from furniture makers to clothing brands, struggled to adjust. Even companies selling entirely domestic products braced for indirect consequences, knowing that if larger corporations faced financial strain, it would trickle down through the economy. And yet, the response was not solely one of panic. Across the country, Canadian businesses began making tough, immediate decisions. Some scrambled to find new suppliers within Canada, while others sought trade opportunities in Europe and Asia. "We are not going to let this destroy us," one business owner declared. "We will adapt, we will survive." But the business world is not the only place people are taking action. Wait until you see how regular Canadians fought back. The emotional Canadian backlash. From booing the American anthem to scrapping Florida vacations, Canadians took this trade war to heart fast. It was not just the political or business elite that reacted. Across the country, ordinary Canadians made their voices heard. Social media campaigns urging people to buy Canadian gained traction overnight. Grocery stores began labeling products with large "Made in Canada" signs, while some retailers openly advertised alternatives to American goods. Vacation plans changed en masse. Every winter, millions of Canadians escape the cold by traveling to destinations in the United States, particularly Florida. But now, a growing number were canceling their trips, opting instead to spend their tourism dollars at home or in other countries. "Why should I give my money to a country that is actively trying to hurt us?" one traveler asked. And then came the national anthem protests. At sporting events, some fans booed the Star-Spangled Banner as a sign of resistance. Others used more symbolic gestures, turning their backs during the song or remaining silent. It was not about hostility toward Americans, as Trudeau had emphasized in his speech, but a statement against policies perceived as unfair and aggressive. "We are not mad at Americans," one protester explained, "but we want them to know that their government's actions are hurting real people, and we will not take it quietly." Social media became a battleground. Hashtags like Boycott USA and Support Canadian Business trended for days as citizens rallied behind their country. Little did they know, Trump had his own chaotic approach that was about to collide head-on with Canada's unity. Donald Trump's strategic chaos. He built a brand on unpredictability. Now he's turned that chaos against America's closest neighbor. With a single announcement, Donald Trump shook the foundation of the United States and Canada's economic partnership, igniting a trade war that neither side had anticipated. His justification? A familiar yet vague rallying cry: America first. For decades, the United States and Canada enjoyed one of the most stable trade relationships in the world. Their economies were intertwined, built on mutual reliance, shared industries, and geographical convenience. But for Donald Trump, stability was a weakness, not a strength. He framed Canada not as a partner, but as a competitor, arguing that the United States had been ripped off for years. Official White House statements justified the tariffs by citing unfair trade practices, even though economic data contradicted the claim. The administration insisted that imposing steep tariffs on steel, aluminum, and other key imports would rebalance the economic playing field. Yet the messaging was inconsistent. One day, the tariffs were essential for national security. The next, they were part of a broader negotiation tactic. At times, they were simply a punishment for Canada's resistance to previous trade demands. The chaos extended beyond policy. Donald Trump's personal approach to diplomacy was as unpredictable as his economic strategy. He launched attacks on Canadian leadership, calling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau weak and dishonest, while praising autocratic leaders elsewhere. These insults were not just rhetorical flourishes, they reflected an erratic governing style that left even his closest advisors struggling to maintain coherence. But even Donald Trump could not push these tariffs without shaking the very foundations of his own party. The Republican divide. Some of Donald Trump's toughest opponents were in his own political backyard. This was not part of the plan. The Republican Party had long been the champion of free trade, and many lawmakers now found themselves caught between party loyalty and economic reality. Mitch McConnell, representing Kentucky, was among the first to voice concerns. Bourbon, one of Kentucky's most valuable exports, was now in the crosshairs of Canada's retaliatory tariffs. The whiskey industry, which relied heavily on international buyers, faced an uncertain future. The irony was undeniable. A Republican senator from a deep red state, now advocating against protectionist policies because they threatened his constituents. Other Republican lawmakers followed suit, Legislators from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, states with heavy manufacturing industries, expressed concerns over job losses and price increases. They had supported Donald Trump's economic populism in theory, but the practical consequences of the tariffs were impossible to ignore. Factories were already seeing supply chain disruptions, and auto industry executives warned that vehicle prices would rise sharply. The split was growing. Some Republicans, particularly those in border states, called for immediate negotiations with Canada to reverse the damage. Others, especially those aligned with Donald Trump's base, doubled down, insisting that short-term pain was necessary for long-term economic independence. The White House, meanwhile, dismissed concerns as overblown, with Donald Trump himself calling dissenters weak and accusing them of undermining his efforts. As Republicans split, United States businesses and consumers braced for impact. The next wave of consequences was about to hit. U.S. businesses and consumer fallout, from grocery aisles to car dealerships. Here is how the trade war blindsided average Americans. For years, the United States economy had thrived on seamless trade with Canada. The sudden tariff war shattered that stability, sending shockwaves through businesses and households alike. For many small-town factories, the impact was immediate. A steel manufacturer in Ohio saw contracts with Canadian buyers vanish overnight. A farm equipment supplier in Iowa struggled to source affordable parts. An auto parts distributor in Michigan faced increased costs, forcing it to consider layoffs. Retail prices also soared. The chief executive officer of a major retail chain, one of the largest in the country, warned that the tariffs would drive up costs on everyday essentials. Fresh produce, meats, dairy products, many sourced from Canada, suddenly became more expensive. Gas prices fluctuated, fueled by market uncertainty. And then there was the stock market, which reacted with sharp declines as investors panicked over trade instability. The pain extended beyond businesses. Families with retirement savings and stock market accounts saw their balances shrink. Farmers, already burdened by shifting trade dynamics, now faced new hurdles as their exports to Canada faced retaliatory tariffs. The cost of living crept higher, a slow but noticeable change that weighed on household budgets. But the conversation was no longer confined to boardrooms or economic reports. Social media amplified every outrage, every rumor, and every headline, turning a trade dispute into a cultural flashpoint. Media frenzy, social and mainstream. In the digital age, a single viral post can stir nationalistic passions or end entire deals. The trade war between the United States and Canada was no exception. Traditional media outlets covered the economic fallout extensively, but it was social media that fueled the emotional response. On platforms like Twitter and Facebook, users engaged in heated debates. Some echoed Donald Trump's rhetoric, framing the tariffs as a long overdue correction. Others highlighted the real-world damage to businesses and workers. Viral threads detailed stories of farmers losing contracts, small businesses shutting down, and grocery store prices climbing. Memes exploded. Some mocked Donald Trump's erratic decision-making, contrasting his praise of authoritarian leaders with his antagonism toward America's closest allies. Others took aim at Justin Trudeau, painting him as either a steadfast leader or a naive idealist. Hashtags like Boycott America and Trade War Trump trended in Canada, while America First and Trump Tough gained traction in conservative circles in the United States. Cable news networks seized on the chaos. Segments featured outraged business owners, frustrated consumers, and economic analysts predicting dire consequences. Pundits debated whether this was a necessary economic shift or a reckless gamble. Meanwhile, the markets responded in real time, reacting to every statement, tweet, or policy shift. Yet before we dive deeper into the past, remember, this media storm was built upon decades of economic bonds. To truly understand the stakes, we must go behind the history, where the roots of this trade war were planted long before these leaders took office. Historical threads. Can you imagine a time when cross-border trade existed long before highways? That is how old the economic relationship between the United States and Canada truly is. Long before modern agreements formalized trade, the two nations were deeply intertwined through commerce, cooperation, and necessity. This economic relationship was not just born out of proximity. but out of shared interests in industries that shaped the continent. One of the earliest recorded trade agreements between the two countries dates back to the Reciprocity Treaty, signed in the middle of the 19th century. This agreement allowed for the free exchange of natural resources, including timber, fish, and minerals. It was a groundbreaking arrangement at the time, setting the stage for a close economic relationship. However, the treaty was later rescinded, largely due to political shifts in the United States, which signaled the beginning of a long and complex history of trade tensions between the two neighbors. By the beginning of the 20th century, industrialization created new opportunities for economic collaboration. The automobile industry, which would later become a defining sector for both nations, started laying its foundation with parts and raw materials flowing freely across the border. As manufacturing evolved, industries such as steel, energy, and agriculture became deeply interwoven, making trade more vital than ever. The cooperation between the United States and Canada took on a new dimension during the two world wars. The conflicts demanded unprecedented economic coordination. Canada played a crucial role in supplying raw materials, weapons, and food to the United States and its allies. This wartime cooperation demonstrated the necessity of a strong trade relationship, further reinforcing economic ties that would only deepen in the decades to come. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, cross-border trade agreements began taking shape to address the growing complexity of economic interactions. The Automotive Products Trade Agreement, signed in the middle of the 20th century, was a landmark moment, allowing for duty-free trade of vehicles and auto parts between the two nations. This agreement not only bolstered the automotive sector, but also paved the way for larger-scale trade deals in the future. Despite these advancements, trade disputes remained. Tariffs and restrictions on certain goods fluctuated over the years, often influenced by political changes in both countries. However, the fundamental understanding remained. The economies of the United States and Canada were too interconnected to allow for complete economic separation. This foundation of trade collaboration ultimately set the stage for the largest agreement in North American history. These threads of trust ran deep until new trade deals redrew the map entirely. The Grand Overhaul. North American Free Trade Agreement was hailed as the future, until the United States, Canada, and Mexico tore it up to create something else. The original agreement, signed at the end of the 20th century, was one of the most ambitious trade pacts ever devised. It eliminated most tariffs among the three nations, created a framework for dispute resolution, and established guidelines for industries ranging from agriculture to automobiles. For decades, the North American Free Trade Agreement reshaped trade in North America, dramatically increasing cross-border commerce. Companies across industries optimized their supply chains, utilizing resources from all three nations to create cost-efficient products. Canadian raw materials fueled American manufacturing plants, while Mexican assembly lines provided affordable production capabilities. However, not everyone viewed North American Free Trade Agreement favorably. Critics argued that the agreement led to job losses in certain sectors, particularly manufacturing in the United States. Some industries struggled to compete with lower labor costs in Mexico, while others faced challenges from increased competition within the region. As political shifts took place in the early 21st century, discussions of revising or even replacing North American Free Trade Agreement intensified. The result was the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which introduced significant modifications to the original framework. The most notable changes included stricter labor requirements in Mexico, adjustments to automotive content rules, and enhanced intellectual property protections. While the core principles of free trade remained, the updated agreement reflected a new era of economic priorities. Yet, even this so-called modernization did not prevent the current clash, because real winners and losers emerged. Real winners versus losers in cross-border trade. Not all industries felt the same triumph. Some soared, others collapsed under the new rules. The impact of North American Free Trade Agreement and its successor, United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, varied widely depending on the sector and region. Certain industries thrived under these agreements. The automotive industry, which had already benefited from the Automotive Products Trade Agreement, saw exponential growth. Supply chains became more integrated than ever, with auto parts moving seamlessly between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The agriculture sector also experienced benefits, particularly in Canada, where farmers gained greater access to American and Mexican markets. However, not all industries reaped the rewards. The dairy sector in Canada faced significant challenges due to new provisions allowing greater American dairy exports into the Canadian market. Likewise, certain manufacturing jobs in the United States disappeared as production moved to Mexico, where labor costs were lower. These changes sparked debates about whether free trade truly served all participants equally. Meanwhile, smaller businesses often found it difficult to navigate the complexities of cross-border trade. Large corporations had the resources to adapt, but many small enterprises struggled with regulatory differences and compliance costs. The shift to United States-Mexico-Canada agreement provided some relief in areas such as intellectual property protection. Yet, challenges remained for businesses trying to remain competitive in a rapidly evolving trade landscape. Knowing who gains and who loses is key to predicting future diplomatic routes. So let's break it down. The diplomatic fork in the road. Could a carefully negotiated truce save both economies? Or is this a road that only leads to deeper conflict? With trade tensions reaching new heights, policymakers face a critical decision: seek resolution through diplomatic negotiations, or escalate economic disputes with retaliatory measures. Several proposals have been put forward to ease tensions between the United States and Canada. One potential solution involves revisiting tariff structures and finding compromises that balance the interests of both nations. Trade negotiators have suggested adjusting quotas on key products, reducing unnecessary regulatory barriers, and expanding cooperation in emerging industries such as clean energy and technology. Another approach involves leveraging existing multilateral organizations to mediate disputes. The World Trade Organization and other international economic bodies have played a role in resolving past trade conflicts, and they could provide a neutral platform for negotiations. However, given recent shifts toward economic nationalism, there is uncertainty about whether these mechanisms will be fully embraced. Beyond government intervention, industry leaders have pushed for greater private sector collaboration. Companies with cross-border operations have an incentive to maintain stability and may advocate for trade-friendly policies that mitigate political tensions. Joint ventures, cross-border investments, and strategic alliances could serve as tools for preserving economic ties, even when political disagreements arise. As discussions unfold, one thing remains clear: the outcome of these negotiations will have long-lasting implications. The decisions made today will shape the economic landscape of North America for decades to come. While some advocate for a return to stronger cooperation, others warn that deeper divisions could permanently alter trade relationships. But there is a bigger world out there, and if the United States can do this to Canada, others know they could be next. Other allies on alert, from Mexico to Europe. If America blindsides its closest neighbor, how do other allies sleep at night? When a nation as economically intertwined as Canada finds itself targeted, the ripple effects extend far beyond its borders. The United States has long been the anchor of global trade, and when it pulls back or shifts its stance, the shockwaves are felt across continents. This trade war is not just a dispute between two neighbors. It is a warning shot that every nation with economic ties to the United States must now carefully analyze. Mexico, a major partner in the North American economic framework, is watching with wary eyes. The trade relationship between Mexico and the United States is built on decades of integration, with factories and supply chains running seamlessly between the two. When the United States imposes tariffs or disrupts agreements, it does not just impact corporations. It threatens the jobs of millions who rely on these cross-border connections. Leaders in Mexico have already signaled that any aggressive economic measures will be met with retaliation. But the deeper concern is that these actions might push Mexico towards strengthening ties with alternative partners. As uncertainty mounts, the potential for realignment becomes more apparent. Across the Atlantic, European Union nations are equally unsettled. Germany, a powerhouse of industry, depends on stable trade flows to maintain its production strength. France and Italy, key players in the global economy, also recognize that disruptions in the North American market could have long-term consequences for their own exports and investments. European leaders have expressed frustration at the unpredictability of American policy, with some calling for a reassessment of their dependence on the United States. This shift is more than rhetoric. It is reflected in increasing discussions about strengthening regional trade within Europe and exploring greater partnerships with Asian economies. Meanwhile, China, the world's second-largest economy, is capitalizing on the situation. As the United States isolates itself from traditional allies, China is positioning itself as a reliable alternative. With strategic trade agreements and diplomatic maneuvers, China is creating opportunities for nations that feel abandoned or at risk due to American policies. The question now is not just about immediate trade battles, but about the broader restructuring of global economic alliances. But what about the auto industry? Ever think about how your car might cross multiple borders before it sits in your driveway, and how all of this is going to affect it? The auto industry and supply chain crisis. The modern automobile is a marvel of global collaboration. Its engine may come from Japan, its steel frame from Germany, and its electronics from South Korea, with final assembly in North America. This intricate network has defined the industry for decades, but trade wars now threaten its stability. Major companies like Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and Jeep rely on seamless supply chains to control costs. When tariffs disrupt the flow of steel, aluminum, and parts, factories must either absorb the losses or pass them on to consumers. A once affordable vehicle can suddenly become out of reach, while auto workers face job uncertainty. In response, manufacturers are shifting operations to countries with stable trade agreements. Others are pausing investments, creating industry-wide hesitation. The impact extends beyond factories. Dealerships, consumers, and repair services all feel the strain. The stakes are higher than ever, and for an industry that thrives on predictability, the road ahead is more uncertain than ever. But what do you think? Let's know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.